Hello, historians, and welcome to the Unit 8.10 Cold War Cuba podcast. In just a moment, you're going to go ahead and pause the podcast in order to read the objective on your own, break it down using our shapes method. Please go ahead and break down your objective now. Let's take a look at the objective pieces that you broke down. For today, we will be describing and arguing. The content we will be looking at is how the events in Cuba fit into the Cold War and who you believe was the aggressor. If you don't know what this word aggressor means, an aggressor is basically somebody who starts a problem. At the end of today's lesson, you'll be answering a 2-question exit ticket that utilizes at least 3 predetermined vocabulary terms. Now that we've broken down the objective, let's jump into the actual content. So, where has the Cold War conflict spread to so far? If we remember, the Cold War was an issue, an argument, a conflict, or a competition between the two post-World War II powers, the United States, represented here by Uncle Sam, and the Soviet Union, represented here by the grizzly bear. These two countries after World War II are pretty much going to have an intense rivalry and competition over ideologies. The United States is a capitalist country wanting to spread capitalism, and the Soviet Union is a communist country wanting to spread communism. Now, we've already seen this competition of these two countries take place in Germany. Please go ahead and annotate Germany on your map. We've also seen this conflict spread to Greece and Turkey, and we know that when the conflict spread to Greece and Turkey, the United States took a very aggressive foreign policy stance. Their foreign policy was called containment, and according to containment, the United States would do anything and everything possible to stop communism from spreading and to also help places avoid communism. Some of those places were Greece and also Turkey. We also saw that the Cold War conflict spread into outer space and even involved the competition over who had the biggest and best weapons, also known as the arms race. We've also recently jumped into Asia and seen the Cold War take place in Korea, in China, and in Vietnam. Today we're going to take a look at a different part of the world, specifically a portion of the world here in what's known as Central America, and we're going to talk about how the Cold War is going to take place in Cuba. Cuba is a small island in the Caribbean, and we're going to find that this heated competition over whether capitalism or communism should take over the world is going to find its way in Cuba. Being that Cuba is so close to the United States, specifically the tip of Florida, we're going to find that communism here in pretty much what could be called America's backyard is going to be very alarming for the United States. Now, before we talk about how the Cold War starts in Cuba, I need to give you a little bit of background history about Cuba, specifically a very important revolution in Cuba that's going to allow for communism to take over. Now, before the Cold War starts, there was a guy right here by the name of Fulgencio Batista. He is a capitalist, and he was the leader of Cuba. Now, because he was capitalist, the United States supported him, and the United States wanted to make sure that he continued to have control of Cuba. The only problem was that Fulgencio Batista was a dictator. And because he was a dictator, he wasn't very popular in Cuba, and he didn't have a lot of support from the Cuban people. Because he didn't have a lot of support from the Cuban people, that pretty much allowed another guy by the name of Fidel Castro to gain a lot of popularity in Cuba. Fidel Castro is a communist, and so he promises a lot of economic equality for the poor. But he also promises to get rid of a lot of the unfair governmental practices that Fulgencio Batista has been using. And so in 1954, Fidel Castro starts to gain supporters and starts to talk about a revolution against Batista. By 1959, 5 years later, Fidel Castro has gained so much support, and his supporters, known as revolutionaries, have been able to spread his message that by 1959, Fidel Castro is able to successfully overthrow Fulgencio Batista's government. Batista and his followers had to flee Cuba in order to save their lives. As we've already seen in several history lessons, when one government falls, the supporters of that government have to flee. They have to leave the country. Otherwise, they could be killed or jailed by the new government. Now that Fulgencio Batista is gone, Fidel Castro takes full power over the country and sets up a communist government. Now, we know that communist governments usually are led by dictators, and this is exactly what's going to happen. Despite his promises for a better Cuba and despite his promises for more freedoms, Fidel Castro will break those promises and he himself will become a dictator. When he becomes a dictator, he starts practicing totalitarianism. Go ahead now and pause your podcast in order to find video link 1 on the Cuban Revolution. As you watch the video on the Cuban Revolution, please go ahead and make sure that you jot down 3 key takeaways on the margins of your notes. Now that you've got an in-depth look at the Cuban Revolution, let's talk about how the Cold War starts in Cuba. With Fidel Castro now in power, we see that Cuba has become a communist country. And since it's now a communist country, we're going to see that the Soviet Union is going to ally itself with Cuba. You've probably already seen and remember this leader here. This is the leader of the Soviet Union, known as Nikita Khrushchev, and this is basically the leader in power in the Soviet Union when the Berlin Wall in Germany was built. Now, when Cuba became a communist country, we're going to find that the relationship between Cuba and the United States quickly deteriorated, meaning fell apart. The United States had a very strong relationship with Cuba when Fulgencio Batista was in power. But now that Fidel Castro is in power, this relationship between the U.S. and Cuba does not exist. One of the reasons why this relationship does not exist is because Cuba is now a communist country, and the United States does not support communism. If we take a look at this political cartoon, we can see the United States here represented by Uncle Sam. We can see that Uncle Sam is trying to hold up these dominoes, which have been labeled by the names of different countries or different areas of the world that have basically fallen to communism. Uncle Sam's goal is to use containment in order to prevent further countries or further areas from falling victim to communism. Pretty much the United States thinks of communism as a disease, and it wants to prevent new countries from becoming infected. The second reason why the United States no longer wants to have a relationship with Cuba is because they want to prevent what's called the domino theory. And the domino theory is pretty much this idea that communism is a disease which is going to infect and cause other countries to become communist. Again, we can see that picture of the domino theory here in the upper right-hand corner. The third reason why the United States no longer wants to have a relationship with Cuba is because Cuba has now allied itself with America's biggest enemy, the USSR. The USSR is now providing a ton of aid and support to Cuba to ensure that Cuba can be a strong communist country. Now, the United States is not okay with Cuba being communist, and so the United States is going to use its aggressive foreign policy known as containment in order to do everything possible to stop communism from spreading into neighboring Central American countries. One of the containment plans that the United States uses against Cuba is a trade embargo. A trade embargo is going to be when one country does not allow other countries to trade with their enemy. For example, in this picture down here, we can see that the United States is very angry. Uncle Sam is creating a trade embargo where he is not allowing other countries to get into Cuba in order to trade. Since Cuba is the enemy, this aggressive action of a trade embargo is pretty much going to cause Cuba to no longer be able to have access to food, to money, to supplies, or to help from the outside world. This is not only going to hurt Cuba economically, but this could also lead the Cuban people to starve and could lead to the entire country falling apart. If the entire country fell apart, then the United States would no longer face a communist threat. When the United States took this aggressive containment policy of creating a trade embargo on Cuba, pretty much any and all small relationships left between the U.S. and Cuba completely fell apart. At this point in time, Cuba and the United States are no longer going to have any type of communication, because this aggressive action is seen as a huge threat on Cuba, and Cuba is not okay with this. Now, why is Cuba such a large problem for America? Even though this trade embargo has been created by the United States is still very worried about Cuba. Here are 3 reasons why. This is the first time in history where a communist threat is so close to home. If we take a look at Cuba, Cuba is not that far from the United States, meaning that Cuba could easily launch a communist attack on the U.S. or could easily launch an atomic war against the United States. And so having communism so close to home is a huge threat. Not only is communism so close to home, but the United States also realizes that Cuba could allow the USSR to come into Cuban territory. If the USSR can come into Cuban territory, then now the USSR has a close area from which to attack the United States from. This is a huge problem. Finally, the United States also knows that the USSR, by having Cuba, is one step closer to winning the Cold War. Now that there is a communist country in Central America, communism could spread into neighboring countries, basically causing the domino theory to come true. Remember that the domino theory is a fear that when one country becomes communist, it will infect all the neighboring countries, making those countries communist countries too. With communism super close, with the USSR being able to land in Cuba and use Cuba as an attacking position, and with the fear that communism will spread throughout Central America and maybe even South America and North America, the United States is now on super high alert. So what is the United States going to do about this communist problem in its backyard? Let's take a look at the current leader of the United States, who is JFK. We've already talked about JFK because he was the American leader during the Berlin Wall crisis in Germany. As a result of communism being too close to the United States, President John F. Kennedy, also known as JFK, wants to get rid of communism in Cuba, even if that means killing the communist leader Fidel Castro. But JFK knows that he has to be careful about how he gets rid of Fidel Castro, because getting rid of Fidel Castro is going to mean that the USSR will want to take revenge on the United States. And a perfect way to take revenge on the United States would be to take all of Berlin. During this Cuban crisis, Germany is still divided in half. Berlin is still divided in half. And as we can see, all of Berlin, even though it's divided in half, all of it is located in the communist section of East Germany. JFK knows that if he strikes or tries to kill Fidel Castro, the USSR will take revenge on America's action by, once again, trying to take all of Berlin. JFK realizes that if he's going to get rid of Fidel Castro, he has to do this in a secret manner. That secret manner is going to be the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is a CIA Central Intelligence Agency plan created by JFK. Go ahead and jump into the next podcast, Podcast 2.